Hello, everyone. My name is Hastings Hill. I'm the Communications and Membership Manager at St. George's Society of New York. Thank you for being here today. Like most people across the world, we were shocked, appalled, saddened, angered, and exhausted by the senseless murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ree Milton, Dominique Remy Fells, and Rayshard Brooks, as well as the many men, women, and children who've come before and after. The Black Lives Matter movement has galvanized the world into what we hope is tangible and effective action to dismantling racism and white supremacist systems. We at St. George's Society recognize that silence is complicity. And to remain true to our mission, we needed to not only make a statement, but make a stand. Today's panel is considered a first step in taking action. We know that many of you, members of our beloved community, have, like us, been educating themselves. This process and these conversations are difficult and really uncomfortable, but they are necessary and they're very much needed. We want to help facilitate that education and support you on your anti-racism journey, as you have supported us for many, many years. So thank you again for being with us today. And now I'd like to pass it on to our Executive Director, Anna Tindley.
Thank you, Hastings, and thank you all for joining us today for this important conversation. Recent weeks have made us all rethink moral culpability and ignorance around systemic racism. At St. George's Society, we have a history of inclusion that we can be proud of through our charitable programs. However, we also recognise that we must ensure diversity and inclusion throughout the entire organisation. With the support of our leadership, we will make a statement of commitment to diversity and inclusion that is both actionable and measurable to help affect real change. Racism is everyone's problem because it erodes the fabric of society, and we have a platform that can help our community overcome these challenges and build a better world for all. I'd now like to hand over to Claudine Moore, a long-time member and now board member of St. George's Society. Thank you, Claudine.
Body. Thank you very much for that, Anna, and really thank you very much to the St. George's Society for hosting what is an extraordinarily important conversation, a difficult conversation, but necessary conversation. My name is Claudine Moore. I am the founder and MD of Seymour Media International Public Relations. We are a PR agency HQ'd in New York, doing work across the UK, US, and Africa axis. I'm also an adjunct professor at NYU, New York University, teaching corporate social responsibility and global public relations. I'm delighted to participate in this sort of a dual capacity as both the moderator and the panelists, as we'll all be having a collective discussion between myself and the panelists. Before I introduce the other panelists, who I'm really excited and honored to have got to know a bit better over the last few days, why are we here today? We always start with why. And we are here today because the Black Lives Matter movement was born out of Black Americans being disproportionately being killed at the hands of law enforcement with no consequences. The assertion being that Black lives, lives that look like me, do not matter. Hence the movement began to emphasize that they do, that we do matter. This is not at the exclusion of any other group. Au contraire, this is to emphasize our inclusion in that. Here is a short video of some of the Black lives that have been lost at the hands of the police in America with no consequences for any of the officers involved. As a Black person, seeing a video like that, I can tell you, is always extraordinarily difficult to see. I'd like to introduce the other panelists. First of all, I'm going to let each of them introduce themselves, but the panelists are Anisha Patel, Linda Evans, and Sonny Singh. And I'd like to start with Anisha, please. Thank you, Anisha.
Thank you. So I'm an active member of St. George's Society as well, and a clinical psychologist and developmental neuroscientist. I've kind of spent the earlier part of my career serving the underserved and vulnerable communities, primarily of color, and now work with children and adults alike in Lower Manhattan.
Thank you. And sorry, let me say Dr. Anisha Patel. Sorry, you weren't there.
Sure.
Can Sonny sing?
Hey everyone, I'm Sunny. I use he and him pronouns. I am a social justice educator and musician based in Brooklyn, New York. And I've been working with a variety of institutions, including schools, universities, nonprofits, and more to really help them bring a stronger racial justice kind of lens to their work. So this is work that's really near and dear to me. I grew up in Charlotte, North Carolina, so racism has shaped my whole life, and sort of social justice education and community organizing are a couple of the ways that I have channeled that sort of pain and trauma from my childhood.
Thank you, Sunny. And Linda Evans.
Hi everyone, I'm really excited to be here. I'm a full-time career advisor at Trinity University in San Antonio, and I have a side business called Launch by Linda, which is career coaching. I have a lot of experiences, as the other panelists have, in race and multiculturalism. I studied American Studies as my major in college, emphasizing Black history. Actually, you wouldn't expect that from an Asian, but I was actually born in China and grew up in Seattle. And I worked as an advisor in the Multicultural Student Services office at my alma mater, and had the chance to teach about multicultural competence in career development classes for the last 3 years. And recently I just published an article about unconscious bias, which I hope we get into a bit. Thank you.
Great. So whenever I moderate and participate in panels, I always like to start off with some definitions, just to sort of lay the foundation so that we're all aware of what we're talking about and how it should be spoken about. So I think I'd like to start with you, Sonny, if that's okay. What is white supremacy? What is white privilege? And what is systemic racism?
Thank you, and thanks everyone for having me. Yeah, so I agree that it's really important to have a bit of a framework and some shared language before we dive in. And so the way that I like to use some of these terms is I actually use the terms white supremacy and racism interchangeably. And why is that? Because there is no racism that is not rooted in white supremacy, right? So if we have to have a bit of a historical lens to this conversation, right? We're not gonna have time to totally unpack the whole social construction of history over hundreds and hundreds of years. But if we think about where did this idea of race come from, and I think many on this call are probably aware that race is a social construct. It's not a biological reality. So it was something that was invented, right? So we have to ask who invented it and why did they invent it, right? And so race was invented by European colonizers to use as a justification, originally a biological, well, maybe even originally a religious justification for exploitation, for theft of land, for theft of human bodies, for violence, for expropriation, right? For genocide, and then eventually a scientific definition. This is really when we see the idea of race getting codified in junk science in the 1700s, right, in Europe and the United States. And basically, this is a way that European colonizers and enslavers of African bodies used to justify their crimes, right? This is an ideology that is used to justify all these horrible, horrible atrocities. So if we understand race as that, we can't disconnect the idea of racism or even the idea of race from white supremacy. These are one and the same. And that's not how most people use these terms, unfortunately. I think a more mainstream definition of racism, which I like to debunk as much as possible, is I think the average person in the United States might define racism as, oh, it's thinking someone is less than you because of their race. And that's a part of it. I would say that's a definition of racial prejudice. But if we're going to talk about systemic racism, if we're going to talk about white supremacy, we really have to think about structural power. We have to think about who holds the power in the society when it comes to race, right? And so clearly, you know, it's more clear than ever that we can't disconnect that from white supremacy, right? And so, racism, systemic racism and white supremacy are essentially systemic domination, right? So rooted in the institutions, rooted in the fabric of our society, really baked in to the way our society operates, and domination, right? This hierarchy, right? It's a hierarchy. It's not just about difference. It's not just about we have different types of people who are sometimes segregated from each other. It's actually that's a hierarchy, and some people's power and privilege, namely white people, is at the expense of Black bodies, is at the expense of brown bodies, right? And so that's how I would like to have us thinking about racism, really not disconnected from power. And then you asked about white privilege. White privilege is basically the individual manifestation of that power and privilege, right? And it's usually something that is completely normalized, completely unquestioned. It's not something that's necessarily the fault of an individual white person. It's something that you're simply born with and didn't earn, and really have been taught not to question, right? And even in many ways, people of color have been taught not to question white privilege and for that matter, white supremacy. So that's where I would start us, and I would love others to kind of chime in with their own ways of explaining these things.
Yeah, I think that's actually great, and I want to sort of emphasize this is quite important. As is quite evident from the optics of this panel, you have this panel is full of people of color, right? You have myself, a Black woman on this call. You have people of color, different races. What's not on this panel is a white person's not on this panel. And I want to emphasize that because as Sunny just now very brilliantly outlined, and thank you so much for that, Sunny, while systemic racism is based on the twisted and deeply flawed philosophy of white supremacy, I want to emphasize that that the dismantling of it is the responsibility of those who built it. And I want to really pause and emphasize that. The breaking down and the dismantling of this is the responsibility of those who built it. We as Black people and people of color should be part of these conversations, but the burden of responsibility of breaking it down rests on the perpetrators. And I just want to make that clear. Anisha, Linda, do you have anything to add to what myself and Sunny have said?
Just that I completely agree. I think I've been having a lot of these conversations in my own clinical practice with my patients and talking about the burden of ending racism, and it typically falling on those that are subject to it constantly, and to really take a look at that and to understand that those who uphold and benefit from racism and white privilege are the ones that need to become more active allies. And so I'm so glad that we're all kind of naming this and having a discussion about it now.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'd like to add, kind of referencing the comment in the chat, that racism did start through white supremacy, through colonization, but I think a lot of people throughout history, throughout the country have internalized that racism, that white supremacy like ideation. And because I know racism exists amongst all races, right? Amongst, and I know we're focusing on Black Lives Matter, but I want to recognize that we all have prejudices and biases within us that we may or may not recognize.
Yeah, and thanks for that, Linda. We'll be touching on some of that sort of later on as well. Inequality in race has been an issue for centuries. Sunny alluded to that in his introduction as to sort of how we got here and the issue that it's been. What is it about the current climate that has brought America and subsequently the world to this, what it kind of feels like a boiling point? And so what about the current climate has brought us here? And more specifically, what do the panelists sort of feel about what is it about George Floyd's murder that brought us to this point? And that's sort of open to all of us.
Yeah, I think it's important to look at the context of the world right now, because obviously atrocities towards Black people have been happening nonstop since the beginning of America, right? It's not like it's gotten worse or like, I don't know, it's hard to know because so much of it goes undocumented. So much of it is not written down, is not caught on camera. is not talked about widely in society. And thinking through all the phases before slavery, after slavery, current day, I think what has brought us to this boiling point is media. Social media is very democratic. Everyone can share whatever they want as much as they can. And I think that outrage is coming through from a lot more directions than just newspapers, because we're talking about it. And I think another thing, honestly, is the quarantine, COVID-19 quarantine. We're all kind of stuck at home. We don't have much to do, like socially, recreationally. And so we're sitting at home thinking about things a little bit more, and stuck to our phones, stuck to our social media feeds, and having these conversations that have been happening nonstop ever since beginning of America. But now it's much more public, and that it's caught on camera. There's lots of bystanders, you know, within the shot of George Floyd. And so it's this community outrage together that's, I think, exacerbated by the stress of COVID, by the boredom of COVID. Honestly, there's more mental energy and emotional energy that people can direct towards social issues that they may not normally be interested in because they're going on vacations or they're whatever, you know. But I think it's a combination of like exposure and people's attentions to this issue.
I would just add on the COVID tip, you know, leading up to this sort of political uprising, 100,000 people in the United States have died from COVID, and those have been disproportionately Black and brown people, right? COVID is disproportionately affecting communities of color. It's exposing so many of the things that are just broken about the way our system works. And so that anger and resentment has been very rightfully growing. And furthermore, we're in year 4, is it, of a federal government that just unabashedly embraces and enables white supremacist ideologies, and, you know, dog whistles, and even more explicit, like just pandering to just bald-faced racism on a daily basis, policy-wise and rhetorically. And I think that's a really different context than the last uprising around police brutality in 2014, 2015 around Ferguson, with Michael Brown and Eric Garner in New York City, right? So that we're in a very different political moment right now. And I think a lot of activists, a lot of young people and just regular people who never thought of themselves as activists are seeing that, you know, playing nice, sending petitions, posting things on Twitter have not been getting results, right? Like we're still seeing this consistent pattern of dehumanization of Black people by a racist police state. And so I think there's really this sense of enough is enough, like things have just been building and building and building.
I agree. I think all of those things, it's like the perfect storm of just several different factors. And I think I read one of the chat comments saying, can we talk about how this is actually a global movement, which is very important to consider too. And I think even though the roots might have started in the Midwest, I think this feels so powerful across nations. And this idea of systemic racism has built up in the history and society of, and has really been weaved into the fabric of so many nations, and including Britain. And so I think that's a part of the conversation too, is to just, while our particular nation is maybe the starting point, it really has evolved and kind of gone into this global movement, which I think is so powerful.
Yeah, I think I agree with everything that everybody else has just said. I think the murder of George Floyd was particularly brutal, and the perpetrator did it in a particularly casual, seemingly casual way. Face void of expression, void of any angst, didn't hear what anybody else was saying for nearly 9 minutes. That's a long time. If we were to do a moment of pause on this webinar for 9 minutes, you'd feel how long that was. And had his hand in his pocket while he did it. The most casual stance anybody can physically take is to have your hands in your pocket. And I think the casualness, juxtaposed against the brutality of what he was doing and slowly killing somebody, was also very reminiscent of lynchings that have happened in the history of this country. And you know, and the symbolism of lynching is something that is still used to this day. There have been many cases in the last few weeks of lynchings of Black men and women on the increase. It's not being spoken about in the news, but it's happening. So, and it's happening a lot. I think in the last month there's been, or the month 6 weeks, there's been about 6 lynchings that have happened across America of Black people that are not being spoken about. So I think it was reminiscent of that for a lot of people. Lynching is a very slow process, and it was done, lynching was something that was done, and it was done in a way that was celebrated. You had, you know, white people would come along to a lynching and it was a day out. It was a day out, there were postcards made of lynchings, and those postcards were distributed. We're lynching a Black man on Saturday, join us. And I think that is what a lot of Black people in America also saw when they saw that lynching. Freudian slip, I said lynching, but it was, we saw that brutal killing. And I think exactly as Linda said, everybody's at home. Everybody's at home, everyone's got time in their hands, and everyone's got time to think a little bit more deeply about things, which is a good thing. And I think, you know, it's interesting how this has manifested in other countries, to other movements, to other people who are talking about sort of the injustice and inequality of other groups around the world. So it does feel like a moment in time where we can facilitate some sort of change. I see Shivani, I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing your name incorrectly, but Shivani in the chat has made a comment that I'd like to address, because I think it's a really important one. So thanks, Shivani, for making this comment. So Shivani has said, I'm a Black woman and I have a quick question. I sort of disagree with the statement of addressing and fixing racism is dense in the responsibility of the people who created it, white people. I think white people, yes, need to hold responsibility and awareness for the weight their oppressive history holds, but at the same time, placing power in their hands continues the power of rectifying the issue, continues this oppressive mindset. Would it be better for the progression of racism to be addressed by people of color? People of color should not only be part of the discussion for a solution, but should be the solution. While I personally agree with some tenets of what Shivani has said, and thank you again for Shivani for adding that, it's a very important issue. Whilst I personally agree with some of the facets of what she said, I do think that too often it's very easy for people to say, white people to say to us, what do we need to do? And that places a burden on us to not only suffer the negative impacts of racism, but then also to have to sort of like, you know, suck up that trauma and what that feels for us, and then have to say, well, you need to do this, you need to do A, B, and C. What I think I personally mean by my introduction when I say it's the responsibility is that there are many ways of approaching this, and I think white people are our allies, and many of our allies, many white people are just as outraged and disgusted about what is happening, as well as Black and people of color. Let's just be quite clear. This is not just Black people and people of color who are upset about this, as many of us are outraged by this. But what I'm saying is, when I refer to that is that the burden of the white people have to also acknowledge some of their blind spots. Some of their blind spots when it comes to this topic of race, systemic racism and being racist. They have to acknowledge blind spots, and they have to think about, how do I facilitate change in myself? How do I facilitate change in my families? How do I facilitate change at work? At every touch point of society, that I have influence over, how can I be responsible, or how can I influence and advocate for anti-racism? I think that's what I mean. And I'd love you, Anisha, to sort of speak to how do you advocate for anti-racism and sort of being anti-racist sort of conversations within your family even? What does that look like? I'm sure in your experience, families that you work with, you have these conversations. So how does that even manifest and begin?
Yeah, I think I've been inundated with questions recently on kind of how to raise anti-racist kids, how to educate racist grandparents or family members, in my practice. And I think the truth of the matter is that I too have stumbled through many difficult and awkward conversations with my own friends and family members, as well as my patients. Like, I'm walking that walk alongside them. And I think that humility becomes so important to understand. And over the course of the past few weeks, I think I hear themes that this is just so tough, or I'm not exactly sure what to say, or I don't want to make it worse by accidentally saying something racist or appearing racist, right? And in terms of grandparents or family members that are too old to change, or my kids are too young to comprehend, I think the silence enables racism. So addressing tough and difficult topics, specifically even for kids, makes them feel safer and actually strengthens our bonds with our family members, and they're more likely to come to you in the future. I can totally appreciate how mentally exhausting and difficult these conversations can be. And so the avoidance is very real, and it really kind of feels like the easy thing to do, to just dismiss comments, jokes, things we hear. But the problem, I think, with that narrative, Claudine, as you've like mentioned, is that it models that, and it models to us that this is not going to go away. It's going to, like, racism is still here. It's always been here. We need to start talking about these things. And I think what's really useful to parents, to especially, or people in family systems, to know is that when we actually choose to handle these tough and difficult conversations, even in a clumsy way, it models that perfection isn't important, and models that if things don't come easy, not to bother, right? It actually changes that narrative and accept that it's better to do it clumsily, awkwardly, and say things that may be inappropriate or learned, but as long as we're willing to educate and adjust and really kind of have these conversations as a process of our learning as well, that is so much more of a meaningful way, I think, to approach these conversations at home, right? Yeah. Like, we don't need to get it perfect, right? Just like when we learn to drive cars, we're not expected to kind of have a smooth ride if you're learning how to drive. And this is the kind of analogy I use with my patients, right? If you're learning to drive stick shift, to be expected to have a smooth ride the first ride seems ridiculous. And so why would we avoid or stop driving, right? Like, let's continue to keep practicing so that we can have these conversations and we can learn to be more of a open society and have these conversations with ease.
Yeah, and I think that's great. And just looking in the comments that we're having, and we have a comment from Cliff, which I think is Cliff Franklin. Thank you for contributing, Cliff. He's made the comment, anti-racism is not enough. Everyone has to confront racism. And I think that's actually spot on. And he's absolutely right in that. And I think part of what you're saying, Anisha, is confronting racism. And sometimes it can be difficult to do that. It can be difficult in the moment.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, it can be difficult to confront racism, but to your point that it has to be done. Otherwise, where's the movement?
Right, I think like letting your child or seeing a family member see you standing up for a person of color or a person with a different background really shows that you are not standing up for oppression, right? You're shifting that ignorance that's passed down from generation to generation that we've kind of all been passively involved in, right? It doesn't, this doesn't mean that you should respond with hostility to your family members or other things. I think there's a way to have a productive and helpful conversation. And I think there's also not a necessity to respond immediately if you become very activated by a person's comments. I think that becomes really helpful, giving yourself permission to think about your response as two or more separate conversations, I think can be very helpful. I think especially with kind of young children, not understanding isn't the same as not noticing, right? And so you don't, just because you think like, oh, it was just a quick comment or a quick joke that so-and-so said, that doesn't mean that they didn't notice and store that in their kind of hippocampus, in their memory store, right? And like a bunch of more of those interactions kids have pattern recognition. And that's how racism is actually handed down to children over time and through kind of and influence our worldview. And so I think Cliff is 100% right. I know him personally and he is great. We have to actually stand up and not just pretend that these things are not in our immediate family. So that's totally fine. We need to call it out. And I think that by calling it out, it becomes really helpful because it's actually going to not like allow that person to have that kind of space in your space. So I'm curious to what Sunny and like Linda have to say to that too.
Yeah, I'd love to chime in on this. I think it's so important to have those one-on-one individual conversations with people like our friends and family, right? People that we actually have a power to influence, because those conversations can be hard. Like I can post on social media. I don't know how people receive it. I don't know if it changes their mind, right? But trying to really influence anti-racism thinking is very hard. And I think I've found from the few conversations I've had in the past few months that you can't just say what you want. You have to make sure that the person hears what you're trying to say. You know, it's about how it's going to be received, not just what you want to say. Because I think a common reaction from people who we notice have some racism, I don't know, thinking or tendencies, maybe defensiveness, right? Because they feel accused, they feel attacked for, they don't feel understood. So I think going back to the principle of seek first to understand, then to be understood, we have to really watch our own emotions so that we don't attack people, we don't accuse them, because even if they are in the wrong, like if we feel they're in the wrong, if they feel like we're attacking them, they're not going to listen. They're going to turn off their ears. They're not going to internalize any of the helpful suggestions we may try to offer. And so I think we need to really be careful with the tone of our voice, how we start the conversation, make sure that they are, that they feel safe and relaxed. Because even though they have these ideas that we may disagree with, there's probably some reason for it. Maybe their parents taught them growing up. Maybe they went to a school that was very big on white supremacy. I don't know, like we don't know people's backgrounds exactly. And so listening to what they have to say, empathizing with them, we don't have to agree with them, but just acknowledging that, okay, you are probably a rational person who has thought about this somewhat, and I hear you. I also want to share my perspective, my different experiences. I've seen racism, I've noticed it more as a person of color. I've studied it in history books, and I see it in career coaching and counseling because I just notice it more. And so here's my perspective, I hear your perspective, and now let's try to find truth. Let's try to find some way to operate our lives that is more fair, that is more kind, that is more social justice oriented. And we can talk all day, we can talk our mouths off, but if people don't listen, it's not going to create actual internal change.
I'd like to just respond to Linda's points. I agree with much of what Linda said, but I do disagree somewhat on the, or not disagree, but I do want to sort of talk about one of the points, and the notion of there are some people that when in any sort of subject, not just discussing race, but if you seek to correct them or you seek to say, well, that's not an appropriate word to use, that they feel attacked. And no matter how nicely you say that, you're, by virtue of just correcting somebody, there are some people that will see and feel a correction as an attack. And that isn't our responsibility to navigate when you're merely correcting somebody. So I have a personal experience that I'll share. Somebody who was very close to me, and as a result of this scenario is no longer close to me, used the N-word. And somebody who's been friends of mine for 30 years, used the N-word. And I told her, I said, it's not appropriate to use the N-word in any context, whether you're paraphrasing, whether you're repeating what someone else said, in no context is it appropriate to say that word out loud. She got extraordinarily defensive. This is one of her best friends of 30 years telling her this. I'm a Black person, this is a white female, and I told her it's not appropriate to use that word under no context. And she was very, very defensive about it. Now, this was a social environment there. I wasn't attacking her for it. I was just saying, Claire, it's not appropriate for you to use that word under no circumstances. And she felt attacked in that moment. She's my friend of 30 years, or she was my friend of 30 years. Is she racist? No, she's not racist. She's my friend of 30 years. I've been Black for well over 30 years. So no, she's not racist. However, is she somebody who had a blind spot and wasn't open to, as Anisha was saying earlier, open to thinking like, oh, well, maybe that's a blind spot I've got. We all have blind spots. And I think in all of this, for all of us, we all have to acknowledge that we can all have blind spots, and to all acknowledge that don't be defensive about our blind spots. For everybody, if we should acknowledge our blind spots, and just all we need to operate from a perspective of being open and being open to the notion of learning more. We've all got more to learn, but there are some people that no matter what you say to them, a correction will feel like an attack. And for that sort of, I would implore people, or I would encourage people who feel that way, to sort of check yourself when you feel attacked in that moment. Like, are you feeling attacked because the person is attacking you, or because you're really feeling defensive because you can't possibly say anything wrong? So I think, so like I said, I'm not disagreeing with Linda, I'm agreeing with you, but I'm just taking that notion of feeling attacked further, because there are some people, even attendees of this conference, of this webinar, sorry, that may feel somewhat attacked by some of the things we're saying. But just be open to, like, no one's attacking anybody, we just want to recognize blind spots and acknowledge them. Sunny, or Linda, do you want to say anything before I turn to Sunny?
Oh, I love that. Thank you for adding that other perspective, because I agree that sometimes you just have to speak truth, right? And that truth can hurt that other person. And I think for all of us, we need to be more open-minded, because all of us on this panel, we have blind spots, like you said, and having that humility is what allows for growth, what allows for personal improvement and open-mindedness. And you made me think of, I don't know, the principle of, like, you may have an intention to communicate something, but that can land totally differently, right? Like the actual results. And so, so some people, I think, who might get offended or feel attacked, they feel like their intention was not malicious. And so they feel attacked because they're like, what did I do wrong? I'm innocent, right? And all of us can feel that like that at some point. So I think just clarifying to them, like, even though you did not mean to offend me, and I know that you value me as a person of color, it still hurts. It still is offensive due to historical, social context that you may not have experienced firsthand. And so I'm letting you know that even if it means nothing to you to say the N-word, it still hurts for me to hear it. And it conjures up, I don't know, negative experiences, trauma, that you probably don't want to bring that up in other people, right? So it might be safer to just not say it. That means it's your choice, but just so you know, that's the effect it tends to have on people.
Yeah, and I love what you just said, Linda. I wrote it down because I think it was really powerful what you said. You said having humility allows for growth, and that is so. Thank you for sharing that, because that is spot on. We all need to grow. The world needs to grow, and you really do need humility for saying that. So thank you for using that phrase. I may tweet it later, Linda, but I'll give you credit. I'll give you credit for it. We just acknowledge we have a few minutes before we take some questions. There have been lots of questions in the chat. Shavoni, you've asked another question. Danielle, Nettie, we can see all your questions. We've got a few more minutes. But before we turn over to some of these questions, but I do want to ask, move on to just another question that I do have for the panel. I'd like us to talk really about so this is a huge topic. We could be talking about this for hours and days, and we're only touching on the surface here. So, but one of the things that I do like, and what I was very sort of passionate about my involvement in this webinar, being one that allows to talk about some solutions, so that, you know, us as panelists collectively, and for our audience as well, can really sort of leave this webinar with having some ideas about sort of solutions. So in that vein of solutions and tools, systemic racism, forefront of the conversations right now in the world, and where do we go if you're in Anisha touched on, you know, conversations within the family, but Sonia, I'd love you to start with, in the workplace, you're in the workplace, how do you begin? If there's some people in this audience right now who sort of witness and can see racism or systemic racism in the construction of their organizations, how do they address that? Do you have any sort of suggestions, and based on your work and your experiences?
Yeah, for sure. And piggybacking off of the conversation that was just happening, I wanted to say that, you know, we've all been socialized into this racist system and this racist way of life. We do it without thinking, right? And so the sort of like default setting of us as individuals, especially non-Black and non-Indigenous folks, and especially white folks, our default setting is to perpetuate racism. And so that's manifesting on an individual level, because that's the status quo that we've been socialized into, right? And like it's already been said, much of this racism is being perpetuated without any thought or intention or malice, right? It's just it's sort of like the default setting, right? And similarly, our organizations and our companies, even those that have, you know, social justice sort of missions, right? Their default settings are also if you're not thinking intentionally about racial equity, you are probably perpetuating it, right? And that's exacerbated even more so for white-led organizations, right? And so I think one of the first steps in the workplace that really has to be looked at is not simply thinking about, I think a lot of organizations bring me in to do racial justice or anti-oppression training, and the mindset is often like, how can we add on some anti-racism work to what we're doing? So we'll create an anti-racism committee who'll do some trainings, maybe they'll hire more people of color, and it'll be like over here, and then business as usual over here, right? And then we have like a little anti-oppression or anti-racism corner here. And I'm not saying that's not worthwhile at all, but I don't think that's the most effective approach, right? I think the question we have to ask ourselves in our organizations and companies is, what are the decisions we're making every single day, every single week, every month, every year? And each of those decisions we make, whether it's where are we ordering lunch from, what does this hiring committee look like, what does this HR policy look like, what does this campaign messaging look like? Every single one of those decisions has some kind of impact when it comes to racial justice issues, has some kind, and you could go down the list, has some kind of impact when it comes to gender, has some kind of impact when it comes to class, right? And so what we have to do is start developing this muscle or this lens to be able to stop and think before making those decisions, right? And develop tools or sort of primes to help us think and foreground racial equity more so, right? Really, and really bake it into and weave it in to the way that we do our work, the way that we run our businesses, the way that we make our decisions at all levels, even the most small and basic decisions, right? Like, what do our email signatures look like, right? There's impacts of all those choices. And so that's just one way to think about it, right? Like, it's not an add-on, it's a way that we have to approach our work, right?
Yeah, absolutely, spot on. Linda, Anisha, would you like to add to anything that Sunny said?
Yeah. I love how my former boss, I just moved to a new job, my former boss at Breonna University in Utah, in a very white university, huge private university, pretty homogenous, but she had worked in Hawaii and was she was more multiculturally minded, I guess. And she saw that I was teaching a lesson on multicultural competence that I created based on my own research, based on my own education in my counseling program at Columbia University that is super focused on social justice. And so I created a lesson, and she heard about it. She had me give it to her, and she's like, everyone needs this in our office, and we need to have it taught in all of our career classes. And she's a white woman, privileged, middle class, you know, and I was so delighted. So she had me train the rest of the career instructors, and they now are required to teach it in their classes. So And at first they were quite intimidated because like, we don't have the stories to back up the things you're teaching, you know, about unconscious bias, about culture shock, about whatever. But I'm like, no, but you really do. You just need to think about it. We've all had experience with race, with racism. And I think as they have taught it and seen the deep impact it has on students in thinking about their careers and workplaces with that lens of race, noticing people's races, noticing the inequalities, noticing their own privilege, that has gotten more support. So I think one way, like addressing what Sunny said about like, you can't just have a committee of people of color trying to do their own thinking, and that's not being integrated into the workplace culture. For me, I mean, I haven't had too much experience besides my last job, but I feel in terms of talking openly about race in the workplace. But I feel like that was a great model in that I found someone who is white, who is an advocate for further education, for further self-awareness, to help other people come on board and be like, look, this is a good thing. It's going to improve our services. It's going to improve our relationships. It's going to improve our brand. It improves everything. And so finding those advocates who are in leadership roles, in decision-making roles, and having them help you spread the message, right? Because I am not in a director role or a manager role. I have influence over my class. And but because of my relationship with her, our relationship of trust, she helped me really broaden that message. And I think if we can each try to find people like that within our workplaces, within our departments, who have caught the vision, who are woke, you know, like, not to overuse that, but who feel like, there needs to be more. And I'm like, well, you're in a position of power. You can influence a lot more than I can. So I can help you.
In addition to finding advocates in leadership, which is exactly right, is also making sure that those organizations have leaders who are have diversity in their leadership as well, so that it's not always a conversation from here up, but a conversation of leader to leader conversations.
Yeah, I love that, absolutely.
I'm acutely aware of the time, and I know that there are so many brilliant questions coming up in the chat, and so I want to sort of turn over to our facilitators to let us know which questions you want us to answer. I can see Nettie, Shivani's asked another question, Danielle, Cliff. So how do you want us to go through these questions, St. George's?
Yes. Hi, it's Hastings. I've been consolidating all of the questions that are going forth. So I will, now it's a panel of you four, and I will be directing the questions to you guys. So just to start things off, we had a question regarding the idea of, we've been talking about racism and how it can manifest, and more often than not, it's not overt. So a term that's come up quite often is microaggressions. So if you guys could speak to the concept of microaggressions and how those are manifest and how to sort of identify those things in your personal lives, in the workplace, within your families.
I'll start with that. Oh, you're so well spoken for a Black person. Oh, you're not like other Black people. You know, as is obvious from my accent, I was born and raised in the UK, and somebody asked about comments about the issue of race in the UK and US, and I think it's important to address that. But those are you know, those are meant to be compliments. Like, I'm talking about Black people, but not you, Claudine. Well, I mean, I personally grew up in an environment in the UK. It was a completely white environment. I was from Hertfordshire. I wasn't from like a city. I was in Hertfordshire, and I had a school of like 1,000 girls in my school, Watford Girls Grammar. Anybody from Watford, and at Watford Girls Grammar, and there were like 3 Black girls in the whole school. It wasn't a horrendous experience by any means. It really wasn't. It was actually a wonderful experience. But you just go through it, getting all these microaggressions, and to a certain point, you have to choose your battles. It's not every microaggression you get that you want to confront, because otherwise you'd be confronting them all day, and that's just bloody exhausting. But there are some times you have to take a stand, and you have to say, and sometimes you take a stand and you have to say, no, that's not really okay. And I think, you know, Linda's point earlier when she said for people, if somebody says something, if somebody says to you, you know, oh, you're so well spoken for, you know, for a Black person, or wow, you speak really well. Okay, how are you expecting me to sound? What were you expecting of me when you see my Black face? What were you expecting? And there's nothing wrong with people being surprised, because people are surprised based on their own experience of people, right? So if you haven't met many Black people, and the Black people you see, or what you see on the news, or stereotypical images on television or in movies, and then you meet a Black person in real life, and you've come in, as Linda was saying earlier, with this whole sort of a backdrop of sort of stereotypical images, then you may be surprised. But when that turns into something sinister, that is when it's a problem. And I think, again, it's just having the humility to know that to understand that there are things you don't know, and there are things you are learning, and having the humility to learn from that. I'll pass it to somebody else.
Sunny?
Yeah, I actually wanted to make a counterpoint, which is, you know, I think we already talked a fair amount about how to, like, more productive ways or more useful ways to deal with these sorts of acts of, you know, in my day when I was a young person, we didn't call them microaggressions, we just called it racism, or interpersonal racism. So we can think about racism as manifesting on many levels. And more often than not, the interpersonal things like microaggressions is what we get really fixated on. Those acts and actions, you know, the Karens and the Beckys that go viral on social media, it's what pop culture fixates on, and in many cases, it's what we fixate on in our organizations and our families. That's not to say it's not important. It is very important and needs to be addressed, and I think we've already talked about that. However, sometimes when we overemphasize this, if we can think about racism as an iceberg, you know, most of the iceberg is below the surface of the water, right? The microaggressions, the Beckys and the Karens, et cetera, are just the tip of the iceberg, right? These are the everyday acts that we see that get a lot of attention, but we often don't ask the more difficult questions, which is what are the policies of our institutions? What are the practices and the ways that racism is baked into so many aspects of our culture that we're not interrogating, right? Because we get fixated on these interpersonal dynamics. Again, that's not to say the interpersonal dynamics aren't important.
Yeah, no, it's true.
But we really do have to confront institutional racism, right? In our healthcare system, in the prison industrial complex, right? In banking and finance policies, right? Like because these interpersonal dynamics are again just the tip of the iceberg, and we really have to see the whole picture.
Yeah, and Alicia Shaw has made a comment. Diversity in leadership is so important, she says. More companies need to step up in that arena. And I think that leads into what you said, Sunny, about diversity in some of these organizations to dismantle some of the systemic racism, as another attendee mentioned earlier about us being part of that too.
So I think this point was emphasized before. Sorry to cut you off, Sunny, but it's so important to know that oftentimes in larger scale organizations, like I've worked in the NHS and I've worked in hospital settings, it feels very much this kind of island where they have these really great inclusion practices or policies, but they're really operating in some sort of isolation or in this island that hasn't been really fully disseminated into the actual system, but it's operating on some sort of kind of arm. And that doesn't seem to be doing enough. And we need to kind of have these conversations at all levels of management to be able to promote that. Whether I know in certain clinics that I've been working in child clinics, like that even means the smallest things, like having like crayons for kids to color that have all skin tones and like variations. So when they're drawing pictures of their families and their friends, they don't have to just have one nude color, right? It goes from the little things all the way to the managerial and big systems. So I think that becomes really important when we're thinking about how to change the culture of organizations from the top to bottom.
There's a comment here in the chat from Anne-Marie Petersmar. Sorry if I've not said that right, Anne-Marie. I think her comment is worthwhile reading out. It's really important. She says here, I think it's important for white people to really hear exactly what, read what I hear in my comments about picking your battles as a person of color. The most important part, she said, of what she said was something racist doesn't mean never say something racist.
Oh,
I'm having a bit of trouble.
I think we've lost Claudine for a bit. I'm just going to reiterate the question is saying, so even if you are a white person who's never been called out for saying something racist, that doesn't mean you never said something racist. I think it points back to the idea is that a lot of these things are ingrained. And we don't know what we don't know sometimes. So that kind of moves into my next question. I know that
and also what she said, to be honest with you, Hastings, what she said was quite important, is that the point is that what Anne-Marie is saying is that it's because people of color sometimes having to choose our battles. I think what the key part of what she said is that part, is that just because you haven't been called out for being racist doesn't mean you've never been said anything racist, maybe, but maybe the person you said it to is like, had 15 microaggressions in the last hour and addressed one, and you're the 15th one and decided not to address it, doesn't mean you didn't say anything. So I think thank you, Anne-Marie for that, because that's really important.
Yeah. I'm just aware of time that we're approaching 2 p.m. And so we've gotten so many amazing questions coming through the chat. I'm going to say we might go over, but we are going to send out the recording. I have one more question, and it sort of relates back to everything, is the diversity in leadership. And so when you are not necessarily in a position of power, how does one encourage, whether it be in the workplace or in personal relationships, how you can encourage these conversations and encourage active solutions to these when you are not the manager in a managerial role, and how does one start these conversations without, especially I know that a lot of people of color, Black people specifically, feel that these conversations need to be had but are not in a position to start them, and like we said before, the burden being on people of color to keep this going. So anyone wants to speak to that?
Yeah, I think curiosity is a powerful weapon for communication, because that expresses both humility and confidence. And I teach this in my networking classes, that when you start with a question, it shows that, first of all, you don't know stuff. We're willing to admit that you don't know something, right? But you also show that you're confident enough to admit that your ignorance about a certain subject is not a negative mark on your character or on your competence. It's just that you don't know something and you want to learn. So I think starting with questions, rather than just lecturing at people, even though that might be the impulse, is like, oh my gosh, I have so much to teach you. But instead of that, which might feel like an attack, like I said, but really starting with curiosity, understanding, where are they coming from? Are these their own ideas? Are these things they've seen in the news? Are these just hearing what their friends have said? Are these ideals they've been raised with, which it's really hard to dismantle a lifetime of beliefs, right? And so starting with a place of trust and understanding that they don't feel like we're judging them, even though we feel really uncomfortable with something they've said, having them feel like we are a friend. We are authentic in wanting to have open communication, that it's not one way, that it's something that we can both be enlightened by. And of course, we want to teach them certain things, but we can also understand their worldview better. And in that way, there's more of a bridge rather than like a one-way shot. I don't know, for lack of a better analogy.
Yeah.
I would just quickly add that I would approach this question like sort of as an organizer, just because you're not in a position of power, you do have power if you start building relationships with your colleagues and start having these conversations with your colleagues. And that's how we shift organizational culture ultimately, right? So it doesn't have to be as concrete as like everyone gets together and makes a demand of management. It could, you know, organizing happens through relationship building. And so I think in our organizations, in our families, we've really been taught to walk on eggshells around this conversation. We've been taught not to have this conversation. Again, especially white people have been taught this, but even a lot of us, people of color, have been taught not to, especially in the workplace, because then we're going to be seen as that angry person of color, right? So we have to break that. We have to break that pattern. And so I think that comes from just practicing how to speak in a more racially explicit way. And that doesn't mean speaking in a racially exclusive way, but it means centering race and racial justice in our conversations. And that can happen over lunch, or now maybe over lunch on Zoom. But you know, through that process of relationship building, I think organizational culture can really change.
I also think, just to quickly add, because I know we're almost out of time, but sharing like the vulnerability aspect of why this matters to you as someone that might not have or hold a lot of power in an organization is really important. I think we've kind of all touched on different conversations where people have said racial comments or sentiments that have really been hurtful or painful, and really kind of exploring that with a curious approach, but also a why, and explaining why that it is hurtful to you, and it is so important, and or why this is really an important change that we need to make, can start framing a non-defensive conversation around the topic. And so I think I use this skill a lot at home, in offices, just with all of our relationships. When we come from that place, and a non-defensive place, we're usually more productive and we're more open to hearing differences of opinion. So that I think is important.
Sorry, and one final question. So we're having these conversations, but like what's next? What can we do in terms of tangible action? If you can give, I know there's so many suggestions and notes, but if you could give one next step beyond the conversation from each of you, what would that be?
I'll start. Like I said, I just wrote an article about unconscious biases. I really think that is what we have the most control over, because it starts with us. It starts with us individually. I am in charge of my unconscious biases. I am not in charge of yours. I can try to influence people's, but I can try to be more aware of when I make those automatic assumptions that a person of a certain race or ethnicity or any identity, right, any identifier, I have these automatic assumptions about people, and I can challenge that by asking myself first, is it true? Are there facts and evidence to back up my assumptions about a Black person, an Asian person, a Latino person, a white person, right? Like, are my assumptions based on facts, or are they just based on previous people? This person is not like every other white person. This person is not like every other Black person, right? Like, people are individuals, even though we all experience similar cultural trends and shifts and things like that. But first of all, is it true? Second of all, is it fair? Am I treating this person fairly as I would any other person of color or white person? And third, is it kind? Am I doing what a kind person would do? Compassion. These are really basic human virtues that I think it starts at the bottom. I mean, at the top too with leaders, but I think it starts with each of us to change the whole culture of our offices, of our country, of our families, that we start with ourselves. Am I treating people kindly? Am I treating people based on facts? Am I treating people based on a sense of fairness? And not just what I feel at the moment, what I've heard about them, but like my experience with them. Am I treating people based on truth and kindness? That would be my ending takeaway.
Sunny, I'll direct it to you next.
Sure. So many things, but in this moment, I just want to uplift rooting out anti-Black racism out of all of our communities. And as someone, you know, many of the panelists today, in fact, are of Asian descent, and many of our non-Black and even some Black immigrant communities, anti-Black racism is so pervasive. So that's one thing that I want to uplift. And one of the ways to do that is to really self-reflect and learn ourselves about how ingrained this issue is, and follow the lead of Black-led organizations. And one that I really would like to shout out is the Movement for Black Lives. They're really carving quite a path right now in terms of synthesizing a lot of this conversation we're having and really taking on this issue in a structural way.
And Anisha?
I think to echo both, all of the panelists, really, I think we're right. The work starts from right here ourselves, and then in our family, and then disseminates to our networks. So avoiding the avoidance becomes so important. So that's just something, the take home point, I think that feels really true. And we live in such a, St. George's Society of New York is such a diverse place. And so taking a look at our own networks and seeing where we can kind of get exposure to new and different experiences and appreciate and recognize that diversity and see the color and see the change and highlight how beautiful that is a really great way to start, I think, this shift and continue the movement. So it's not just a moment.
And Claudine.
Yeah, thank you.
Wrap us up.
Yeah, I want to say thank you to, everyone's comments have been great, but thank you for Sunny for addressing the comment of anti-Black sentiment, even within, communities of color, within the Asian communities, with Hispanic communities. Anti-Black sentiment is pervasive, and that's something that not many people in your audience may not know. So thank you, Sunny, for saying that. I think my comment, and there's so many things that we could say to end this with, but I think my comment would be to say to people, don't be afraid. I think a lot of this is based in fear. Why are you fearful of Black people? Why are you fearful of people of color? Like really thinking about where that fear comes from, and going back to what Sunny said in the beginning about the roots of systemic racism. Like a lot of it is based in fear. There is a movement now where you're going to see people taking action. So you're going to see more Black people and more people of color in leadership positions. And I would say to anybody for anybody who feels like this sort of empowerment of people of color and of Black people specifically is fearful to them, really thinking about why are you fearing that? Because I think a lot of that fear and a lot of that fragility rests in the notion that something is being taken away from you. If we suddenly start having more Black people and more people of color in leadership positions, they're taking away from us. If we start empowering the Black community, that's taking away from us. Anthony Joshua, who's a well-known British boxer, who happens to come from Watford, my hometown, I'm just saying, he recently said people should, stop, Black people specifically should start buying from other Black people. He didn't mean that to say don't buy from white organizations. He's saying also make sure you're buying from your Black organizations. And many people in the press back home in the UK were outraged by that, because there's a notion of if you empower people, it's going to take away from them. And what I would say is, think about why you are afraid. What are you afraid of? And start from there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much to Anisha, to Sunny, to Claudine, to Linda for joining us today. This, we tried to pack.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. We tried to pack quite a bit into a small time. And there's so much more. Again, this is centuries in the making. But we wanted to thank you so much for joining us, and to let everyone watching know that we will be sending out a recording as well as a list of resources and next steps where you can move forward in your journey. And again, thank you everyone for being here and being open and willing to have the hard conversation. So
thank you for having us.
Have a lovely, wonderful rest of your day, rest of the weekend, and be well.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care of yourselves.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everybody.